Chapter 5. Survivors for a Time. Morning classes had been cancelled. They resumed after lunch. Maybe it was rushing things, but there was nothing else to do with an entire school's worth of anxious, uneasy students. Routine would keep them from wandering off and frightening themselves to death in the aftermath of Sumi's murder. Even so, it was a strained routine. Homework was forgotten. Questions written on chalkboards went unanswered, and even the teachers clearly wanted to be elsewhere. Going back to normal after someone had died was never easy. When that someone had been brutally killed, all bets were off. Dinner was worse. Nancy was sitting across from Jack and Jill when the girl with the brown braids walked up to the table and dumped her soup over Jack's head. "Oops," she said, flatly. "I slipped." Jack sat rigidly unmoving, soup dripping down her forehead and running down her nose. Jill gasped, leaping to her feet. "L'Oreal!" she shrieked, the sound of her voice bringing all other conversation in the dining hall grinding to a halt. "How could you?" "It was an accident," said L'Oreal. "Just like your sister there accidentally took apart Angela's guinea pig and accidentally murdered Sumi. She's going to get caught, you know. This would all go a lot faster if she'd confess." "L'Oreal sneezed in that before she poured it on you," said the girl's companion to Jack, a look of fake concern on her face. "Just thought you'd want to know." Jack began to tremble. Then, still dripping soup, she jerked away from the table and bolted for the door, leaving Jill to run after her. Half the students burst out laughing. The other half stared after her in mute satisfaction, clearly condoning anything that made Jack miserable. She had already been tried and found guilty by a jury of her peers. All that remained was for the law to catch up. "You're horrible," said a voice. Nancy was only a little surprised to realize that it was hers. She pushed back her chair, leaving her own dinner of grapes and cottage cheese relatively untouched, and glared at the two. "You're horrible people. I'm glad we didn't go through the same door, because I would hate to have traveled to a world that didn't teach its tourists any manners." She turned and stalked away, head held high, following the trail of soup out of the dining room and down the hall to the basement stairs. "You walk slow, but you move fast. How do you do that?" said Cade, catching up with her at the top of the stairs. He followed her gaze down into the darkness. "That's where the Addams twins live. They were in your room for a while until the kid who had the basement before them graduated." Had he been to the same world? "No, he visited a race of mole people. I think he realized he enjoyed sunshine and bathing, and sort of gave up on the idea of going back." "Oh." Nancy took a tentative step down. "Is she going to be all right?" "Jack doesn't like being messy. They have their own bathroom. She'll be all cleaned up and back in tip-top, faintly morbid shape before group is over." Cade shook his head. "I just hope this is as bad as it gets. Jack can handle a little soup, and she worked for a mad scientist. For her, the wrath of the locals is all part of a day's work. But if people want to get violent, she'll fight back, and that'll just prove that they were in the right to accuse her." "This is awful," said Nancy. "I let my parents send me here because Miss West said she understood what had happened to me and could help me learn how to live with it." "And because you were hoping that if you understood it, you'd be able to do it again," said Cade. Nancy didn't say anything. He laughed ruefully. "Hey, it's okay. I understand. Most of us are here because we want to be able to open our doors at will. at least at first. Sometimes the desire goes away, and sometimes the door comes back. Sometimes we just have to learn to deal with being exiles in our home countries." "What if we can't?" asked Nancy. "What happens to us then?" Cade was silent for a long moment. Then he shrugged and said, "I guess we open schools for people who still have what we want most in the world. Hope." Sumi said hope was a bad word. Sumi wasn't wrong. Now come on, let's get to group before we get in trouble. They walked silently through the halls, and they saw no one moving in the rooms around them. The idea that sticking together was the only way to be safe seemed to have taken root with preternatural speed. Nancy found herself matching her steps to Cade's, hurrying to keep up with his longer stride. She didn't like hurrying. It was indecorous and would have resulted in a scolding back in the underworld. Here, however, it was necessary, even encouraged, and there was no reason to feel guilty about it. She tried to hold to that thought as she and Cade stepped into the room where group was being held. Everyone turned to look at them. L'Oreal actually sneered. "Couldn't get the little killer out of her basement?" "That's quite enough, Miss Youngers," said Lundy sharply. "We have already agreed to stop speculating about who may have harmed Sumi." "She gets a name now, not a title and surname," thought Nancy. "That's not right. The dead deserve more dignity, not less. Dignity is all the dead possess." Aloud, she said nothing, only made her way to an open chair and sat. She was gratified when Cade took the seat next to her. L'Oreal's glare intensified. Apparently Nancy wasn't the only one who found Cade beautiful, although she would have been willing to bet she was the only one who found his beauty more aesthetic than romantic. "You agreed," said L'Oreal. "The rest of us are scared. Who would kill her like that? And mutilating the body afterward, that's just sick. We have a right to want to know what's going on and how to keep ourselves safe." "I'm reasonably sure she bled out from her injuries, given the mess. Corpses don't bleed as much," said Jack. Everyone in the room turned to see the twins, freshly scrubbed and wearing clean clothes, as they made their entrance. Jack looked more the old-fashioned professor than ever, wearing a tweed vest over a long-sleeved white shirt that buttoned at the wrists. Jill was wearing a cream-colored gown that Nancy would have considered sleepwear, not something to wear to group therapy. Whoever killed her was no scientist. "What do you mean?" asked one of the few boys, a tall Latino kid who was spinning a long piece of wood carved to resemble an ulna between his fingers. Nancy felt an odd kinship when she looked at him. Perhaps he'd been to some place like her underworld, filled with shadows, secrets, and safety. Perhaps he would understand if she went to him and spoke of stillness and respect for the dead. But this was not the time. Jack met the question with a haughty sniff and a too calm, "I saw her body like the rest of you. I know some of you have decided that I'm responsible for her death. I know further that those of you who believe my guilt will probably refuse to believe anything else. Draw on what you know of me. If I had decided to start killing my classmates, would I have left a body?" The boy with the bone raised an eyebrow. "She makes a good point," he said. "Making a good point doesn't mean she's not a killer," said L'Oreal. But the heat was gone. Her accusations had been met with reality, and they didn't have any place else to go. She crossed her arms and slouched back in her chair. "I'm keeping an eye on her." "Good," said Lundy. "We all need to be keeping our eyes on each other right now. We don't know who hurt Sumi. Eleanor is working with the authorities, and we should know more soon, but in the meantime we need to be watching out for one another. No one goes anywhere alone. Yes, Miss Youngers?"
L'Oreal lowered her hand as the attention of the group switched back to her. "What if one of us finds our door before the killer's caught?" she asked. "I can't take someone through with me just because we're not supposed to go anywhere alone, and I am not missing the passage back over this, I'm not."
"I think we can all agree that if someone happens to find their door while we're still staying together, the person whose door has been found will go, and the person who is left behind will find another buddy," said Lundy, with deliberate precision.
Nancy realized with a start that Lundy didn't think any of them were going to find their doors. Not soon, maybe not ever. Lundy had given up on them. It was clear by her tone and by the way she chose her words. And maybe that made sense. Lundy's doors were closed, no matter where things went from here. Lundy needed to adapt to the idea that this was the world where she was going to die. "Try for groups of 3, said the boy with the bone. "If you can't manage that, try not to find your door." Some of the students laughed. Others looked pained. L'Oreal was among the latter.
"Tell us about your door, Miss Youngers," urged Lundy.
"I almost didn't see it," said L'Oreal. Her voice turned distant. "It was so small. This perfect little door, carved into the lintel below the porch light, like a door for moths. I just wanted to see what it was, that was all. So I got up really close, and I knocked with the tip of my pinky finger. The world went all twisty and strange, and then I was standing in the hall on the other side of the door, looking back on this impossibly huge porch. I didn't go through, it pulled me. That was how bad the web world wanted me." L'Oreal's story was grand and sprawling, a majestic, epic tale of spider princesses and tiny dynasties. Her eyes had always been keen, but after spending a year in service to the smallest, they had sharpened so much that she had to wear lenses made of carnival glass to keep the world from being so magnified that it was painful to behold. She had fought, and she had triumphed. She had loved, and she had lost, until finally the Queen of Dust had asked if she would become a princess of the land, and stay forever. "I said I wanted nothing more, but that I had to go home and tell my parents before I could accept," said L'Oreal, sniffling. The tears had started to fall somewhere around the death of her beloved wasp prince, and seemed set to continue for the foreseeable future. "She told me it would be hard to find the door again, that I would have to look harder than I had ever looked in my life. I said I could do it. That was almost 2 years ago. I've looked everywhere, but I haven't seen my door."
"Some doors open only once,"
said Lundy. There was a murmur of agreement from the room. Nancy frowned and sank deeper into her seat. It seemed cruel to dredge up everyone's pasts like this, pin them quivering to the floor, and then say things like that. L'Oreal surely knew by now that she probably wasn't going back through her tiny door to her even tinier world. She was smart enough to have figured it out for herself. What was the point in saying it? If this was the school for those who wanted to come to peace with their voyages and remember them fondly, she would have hated to see the other campus.
"She said I could come back," said L'Oreal. "She promised me. Queens keep their promises. I just have to look more closely. Once I find the door, I'm gone." "And your parents? Are they prepared for this inevitable disappearance?"
L'Oreal snorted.
"I told them where I'd been. A year for me, 12 days for them. And they said I'd clearly been through some trauma and couldn't be trusted. They sent me here so I'd stop being crazy. But there's nothing wrong with me. I went on a journey, that's all."
"A journey to a documented world, even," said Eleanor. She was standing in the doorway, new lines of exhaustion graven into the soft skin around her mouth and eyes. She looked like she had aged a decade in a day. "There have been 5 children pulled into the web world since I began seeking you all out. 2 of them found their way back again after returning home. So you see, there is hope. For L'Oreal and for all of us. Our doors are hidden, but by looking closely enough we can find them."
"Eleanor," Lundy stood. "You're supposed to be resting."
"I've had rest enough to last a lifetime, and only a lifetime for the rest of what's to be done," said Eleanor. She moved away from the door. Several students rose to help her to an open chair. She smiled, patting at their cheeks. "Good children, all of you. Yes, even you, Lundy. You're all children to me, and I, your teacher, the only one who refuses to lie to you. So listen to me now, because it sounds like you're doing a fine job of confusing and upsetting yourselves. You will not all find your doors again. Some doors really do appear only once, the consequence of some strange convergence that we can't predict or recreate. They're drawn by need and by sympathy, not the emotion, the resonance of one thing to another. There's a reason you were all pulled into worlds that suited you so well. Imagine for a moment if you'd fallen into the world described by your neighbor instead." Nancy glanced at Jack and Jill, uneasily imagining what her life would have been like if she'd found their door instead of her own. The Moores didn't seem to care about stillness, only obedience and blood. Neither of those things were strong suits of hers. All around her, other students exchanged equally uncomfortable glances, making their own connections and finding them just as unpleasant as she did. Sumi had nonsense in her heart, and so a door opened that would take her to a world where she could wear it proudly, not hide it away. That was her real story, finding a place where she could be free. That's your story too, every one of you. Eleanor tipped her chin up. Her eyes were clear. You found freedom, if only for a moment, and when you lost it, you came here hoping it could be found again. I hope the same, for each of you. I want to make excuses to your parents when you disappear, to tell them that runaways will always run again if they have half the chance. I want to see the back of you more than I want almost anything in this world." What she wanted most didn't need to be spoken, for they shared her hunger, her brutal, unforgiving desire. What she wanted most was a door, and the things that waited on its other side. But unlike the rest of them, she knew where her door was. It was simply closed to her for the time being, until she could find her way back to childhood. The boy with the wooden bone put his hand up. "Eleanor?" "Yes, Christopher?" "Why did your door stay while all ours disappeared?" He bit his lip before adding, "It doesn't seem fair for it to work like that. We should have been able to go back."
"Stable doors like Miss West's are less common than the temporary kind," said Lundy, back on familiar ground. "Most children who go through them don't come back, either on their first trip or after making a short return to their original world. So while we have records of several, the chances of finding a stable door that resonates with the story you need are slim."
"What about, like, Narnia?" asked Christopher. Those kids went through all sorts of different doors, and they always wound up back with the big talking lion." "That's because Narnia was a Christian allegory pretending to be a fantasy series, you asshole," said one of the other boys. "C.S. Lewis never went through any doors. He didn't know how it worked. He wanted to tell a story, and he'd probably heard about kids like us, and he made shit up. That's what all those authors did. They made shit up, and people made them famous. We tell the truth, and our parents throw us into this glorified loony bin."
"We don't use terms like that here," said Eleanor. There was steel in her tone. "This is not an asylum, and you are not mad. And so what if you were? This world is unforgiving and cruel to those it judges as even the slightest bit outside the norm. If anyone should be kind, understanding, accepting, loving to their fellow outcasts, it's you. All of you. You are the guardians of the secrets of the universe, beloved of worlds that most will never dream of, much less see. Can't you see where you owe it to yourselves to be kind, to care for one another? No one outside this room will ever understand what you've been through the way the people around you right now understand. This is not your home, I know that better than most, but this is your way station and your sanctuary, and you will treat those around you with respect." Both boys wilted under her glare. Christopher looked down. The other boy mumbled, "Sorry." "It's all right. It's late, and we're all tired." Eleanor stood. "Get some sleep, all of you. I know it won't be easy. Nancy, can you—"
"Already said I'd room with her tonight," said Cade.
A wave of relief washed over Nancy. She'd been afraid she would have to go to another room, and while she hadn't been there long, she was already attached to the familiarity of her own bed. Eleanor looked at Cade thoughtfully. "Are you sure? I was going to suggest she room with someone on her hall and that you lock your door tonight. This is a great imposition."
"No, it's fine. I volunteered."
Cade flashed a quick smile.
"I like Nancy, and she was Sumi's friend. I figure a little stability will do her good, and that makes any inconvenience to me completely beside the point. I want to help. This is my home."
He looked slowly around the room.
"My forever home. I turned 18 last month. My parents don't want me, and the Prism wouldn't have me back even if I wanted to go. So it's important to me that we take care of this place, because it's been taking care of all of us since the day we got here."
"Go to bed, my darlings," said Eleanor. "This will all look better in the morning." The body lay in the front yard, covered in a thin sheen of dew, face turned up toward the uncaring sky. The dead were capable of sight, as Nancy would have been quick to point out had she been asked. But this body saw nothing, for it had no eyes, only black and blood-rimmed holes where eyes had once been. Its hands were folded neatly on its chest, glasses clutched in cooling fingers. L'Oreal Youngers would never find her door, which had been waiting for her all this time, tucked into a corner of her bedroom at home, half an inch high and held in place by the most complicated magics the Queen of Dust, her adopted mother, could conceive. It would linger another 6 months before the spells were released, and the Queen took to her chambers for a year of mourning. She would never have another grand adventure, or save another world. Her part in the story was over. She lay there, unmoving, as the sun rose and the stars winked out. A crow landed on the grass near her leg, watching her warily.
When she still didn't move, it hopped on her knee, waiting for the trap to spring. When she still didn't move, it launched itself into the air and flew the few short feet to her head, where it promptly buried its beak in the bloody hole that had been her left eye. Angela, she of the dissected guinea pig, whose enchanted sneakers had once allowed her to run on rainbows, was just stepping out onto the porch, rubbing the sleep from her eyes and intending to scold her roommate for sneaking out when they were supposed to stay together. Sometimes L'Oreal couldn't keep her eyes closed long enough to fall asleep, and then she had a tendency to roam the grounds, looking for her missing door. It wasn't unusual to find her dozing on the lawn. At first, Angela's mind refused to register L'Oreal's motionless body as anything unusual. Then the crow pulled its bloody beak out of her eye socket and cawed at Angela, angrily protesting the interruption of its breakfast. Angela's scream sent the crow flapping off into the morning sky. It didn't wake L'Oreal. Chapter 6. The Bodies We Have Buried. All the students had been gathered in the dining hall, most dragged from their beds by either Angela's shrieks or the staff pounding on their doors. Nancy had been jerked awake by Cade shaking her shoulder, leaning so close that she could see the delicate filigree pattern of lines in his irises. She had jerked away, blushing and clutching the sheets around herself. Cade had only laughed, turning his back like a gentleman while she got up and put her clothes on. Now, sitting at a table with a plate of scrambled eggs getting cold in front of her, Nancy found herself clinging to the memory of his laughter. She had the feeling that no one was going to be laughing here for quite some time. Maybe not ever again.
"L'Oreal Youngers was found dead this morning on the front lawn," said Lundy, standing ramrod straight in front of them, her hands folded in front of her. She looked like a porcelain doll on the verge of shattering. "I was against telling you anything more than that. I don't feel that such morbid things are appropriate for the ears of young people. But this is Miss West's school, and she felt your knowing what had happened might make you take her request that you stay together more seriously. Miss Youngers was found without her eyes. They had been removed. We thought at first that it might have been predation by local wildlife, but a closer study of the body showed that they had been removed with a sharp object."
No one asked what kind of sharp object, not even Jack, although Nancy could see that she was practically vibrating from keeping her questions contained. Jill, in contrast, seemed perfectly serene, and was one of the few students who was actually eating. Spending a few years in a horror movie must have done a great deal to harden her sensibilities.
"Unlike Sumi, L'Oreal's parents were still involved with her care, and we have not yet contacted the authorities."
There was a catch in Lundy's voice.
"Eleanor is in her chambers deciding what to do. Please finish your breakfasts and then return to your rooms. Do not go anywhere alone, not even the restrooms. The school is not safe."
She turned, not waiting for them to respond to her, and walked quickly to the exit. When she was gone, Jack finally frowned and let one of her questions out. "Eleanor sat there last night and said she was looking forward to lying to our parents about what had happened to us," she said. "Why can't she just make L'Oreal disappear and tell that lie?"
"Not everyone is as comfortable as you are with the idea of getting rid of bodies,"
said Angela through her tears. She had been crying since finding L'Oreal's body. It didn't look like she was ever intending to stop. "It's not a bad question," said Christopher. He touched his bone nervously as he spoke. For the first time, Nancy wondered if it might be real, instead of wood as she had first assumed.
Miss West already has a system in place for making it look like we ran away when we really went home. Why shouldn't she lie to L'Oreal's family? They lost her either way. At least a lie means we can all stay here instead of going back."
Going back had two distinct meanings at the school, depending on how it was said. It was the best thing in the world. It was also the worst thing that could happen to anybody. It was returning to a place that understood you so well that it had reached across realities to find you, claiming you as its own and only. It was being sent to a family that wanted to love you, wanted to keep you safe and sound, but didn't know you well enough to do anything but hurt you. The duality of the phrase was like the duality of the doors. They changed lives, and they destroyed them, all with the same simple invitation. Come through and see. "I don't want to stay in a place where we just make bodies go away," said Angela. "That isn't why I came here."
"Get off your high horse," snapped Jack. "Bodies are a consequence of life. Or do you truly mean for us to believe that when you were running along rainbows, you never saw anyone fall? Someone plummets out of the sky, they're not going to get up and walk away from it. They're going to die. And unless they fell into a place like the moors, they're going to stay dead. Someone disposed of those bodies. One slip, and they'd have been disposing of yours."
Angela stared at Jack, eyes wide and horrified. "I never thought about it," she said. I saw people fall. The rainbows were slippery. Even with the right shoes, you could fall through if you slowed down too much."
"Someone disposed of those bodies," said Jack. "Ashes to ashes, right? If we call L'Oreal's parents, if we tell them what happened, that's it. We're done. Anyone who's under 18 gets taken home by their loving parents. Half of you will be on antipsychotic drugs you don't need before the end of the year. But hey, at least you'll have someone to remind you to eat while you're busy contemplating the walls. The rest of us will be out on the streets. No high school degrees, no way of coping with this world, which doesn't want us back." "At least you have prospects," said Christopher, giving his bone another spin. "How many colleges you been accepted to?" "Every one that I've applied to, but they're all assuming I'll graduate before I come knocking," said Jack. "And of course I've Jill to consider. I can't go running out into the world without making provisions for my sister."
"I can take care of myself," said Jill. "You won't have to," said Eleanor. She walked wearily into the room, looking toward Jack and Cade, and said, "Make her go away, darlings. Put her someplace where I'll never find her, not if I look for 1,000 years. We'll have a memorial service. We'll honor her as best we can. But I can't endanger us all because of one lost life. I almost wish I could. I would feel less like a monster and more like the child who danced with foxes under the slow October moon. I simply cannot bring myself to do it."
"Of course,"
said Jack, and started to stand. Angela was on her feet first. "She killed her, and now you're going to let her have the body?" she shrilled, pointing at Jack. Her face was a mask of outrage. "She's a murderess. L'Oreal knew it, I know it, and I can't believe that you don't know it."
"Points for knowing the feminine form of murderer, although I'm a little insulted that you feel the need to put a lacy bow on the crime before you can believe I committed it," said Jack. "What would I do with a pair of eyes, Angela?
I don't care about the visual sciences. I'm sure there were some fascinating adaptations to her cones and rods, but I don't have the facilities or equipment here to study them. If I were going to kill her for her eyes, I would have done it in 10 years. After I was nicely established as the head of research and development for a biotech firm big enough to make murder charges just go away. Killing her now benefits me not at all. Can we stop pointing fingers at each other and deal with this? Please? Cade stood. We already have one body on our hands. I don't want any more.
I can help, said Nancy. The others turned toward her. She reddened slightly, but pushed on, saying, I can make sure nothing is done that's not respectful toward the dead. The flesh they leave behind when they depart doesn't bother me.
You're a creepy girl,
said Christopher approvingly. He stood, tucking his bone into his pocket.
I'll help as well. The skeleton girl would never forgive me if I didn't.
I won't, said Jill. It would ruin my dress. Thank you, all of you, said Eleanor. Classes have been cancelled for the rest of the morning. We'll see you after lunch, once you've had time to put yourselves together again.
Bad choice of words, said Jack.
But she looked thoughtful, almost pensive, as she turned her face away and led Cade and Nancy out of the room. Christopher brought up the rear, his bones sticking out of his back pocket like an up-thrust middle finger. The door swung closed behind him. Together they walked out to the porch. L'Oreal was still on the lawn, covered by a sheet, and for a moment all Nancy could think was that if this didn't stop soon, they were going to run out of bedclothes. Nancy, Christopher, and Jack kept walking. Cade stopped.
I'm sorry, he said. I can't. I can't. This was never my job.
Because he'd been a princess in Prism, before they'd learned that he was really a prince. Because, unlike the rest of them, he had never been responsible for tending to the dead. He'd killed people, sure. That was what had earned him the title of Goblin Prince. But his part in their deaths had ended on the blade of his sword. It's all right, said Nancy gently, looking back over her shoulder at him. The dead are much more understanding than the living. Let us take care of her. You keep watch.
I can do that,
said Cade, relieved. Nancy, Jack, and Christopher made their way to the body. They came from very different traditions. For Nancy, the entire experience of death was revered. For Christopher, the flesh was temporary, but the bones were eternal, and deserved to be treated as such. For Jack, death was an inconvenience to be conquered, and a corpse was a Pandora's box of beautiful possibilities. But all of them shared a love for those who had passed, and as they lifted L'Oreal from the ground, they did so with gentle, compassionate hands.
If we take her to the basement, I can mix up something to strip the flesh from her bones, said Jack. The skeleton will still appear fresh to any forensics tests, but it's a start. Once she's a skeleton, I might be able to find out what happened to her,
said Christopher, sounding almost shy. There was a pause. Finally, dubiously, Jack said,
I'm sorry, but it sounded like you just confessed to being able to talk to bones. Why have we never heard this before? Because I was there when you said you could raise the dead. I saw how everybody reacted. And I enjoy having a social life at this school, said Christopher. It's not like I can go hang out at the pizza parlor in town if the other kids stop talking to me. And don't say you and your sister would have talked to me. The two of you don't talk to anybody. "He's got you there," called Cade from the porch. Nancy frowned. "They talked to me."
"Because Sumi made them, and because you went to a world full of ghosts," said Christopher. "I guess that was close enough to living in a horror movie that they were cool with you. And they talked to Sumi because she didn't give them a choice. Sumi was like a small tornado. When she sucked you up, you just tightened your grip and went along for the ride." "We keep to ourselves for good reason," said Jack stiffly, adjusting her grasp on L'Oreal's shoulders. "Most of you got unicorns and misty meadows. We got the moors. And if there was a unicorn out there, it probably ate human flesh. We learned quickly that sharing our experiences with others just drove them away. And most of the social connections at this place are based on those shared experiences. On the doors and on what happened when we went through them. I went to a country of happy dancing skeletons who said that one day I'd come back to them and marry their skeleton girl," said Christopher. "So, pretty sunshiny, but sort of sunshine by way of Dia de los Muertos." "Maybe we should have talked to you a long time ago," said Jack. "Let's get L'Oreal to the basement." They carried her around the side of the manor, walking until they found the ground-level doors that had once been used by tradesmen delivering coal or food to the house above. Their hands were full, and so Nancy twisted to look over her shoulder as she called, "Cade, we need you." "This I can do," said Cade. He jogged past them and opened the cellar doors, releasing a rush of cool, sepulchral air. He held the doors until the others were through, and then he followed them, closing the doors with a final-sounding clank that left them in near darkness. Nancy had dwelt in the halls of the dead, where the lights were never turned above twilight for fear of hurting sensitive eyes. Christopher had learnt to navigate a world of skeletons, none of whom had eyes anymore, and many of whom had long since forgotten about the squishy living and their need for constant illumination. Jack could see by the light of a single storm. Only Cade stumbled, managing not to fall as the group made their way to the base of the stairs. "Can you hold her up without me for a second?" asked Jack. "I should turn on the lights before one of you buffoons trips and damages something valuable." "See, that's the other reason no one talks to you," said Christopher. "You're sort of mean-like, all the time, even when you don't have any real reason to be. You could just say please." "Please, can you hold her up without me for a second, so that we don't knock over the jug of acid I was planning to use to dissolve her flesh?" said Jack. "I enjoy having non-skeletal feet. Perhaps you do as well." "For now," said Christopher. He shifted his grip around L'Oreal's torso, getting his arms locked. "All right, I think I have her." "Excellent. I'll be right back." The body seemed to grow heavier in Nancy's and Christopher's arms as Jack let go. They heard her moving away, steps light on the concrete floor of the basement. Then, calmly, she said, "You may want to close your eyes." They tensed, expecting a blazing surgical light. Instead, when she flipped the switch, a soft orange glow bathed the room, revealing metal racks filled with jars and lab equipment, dressers bulging with wispy lace and ribbons, and a stainless steel autopsy table. There was only one bed. Nancy made a small sound of dismay as she realized what this meant. "You sleep on the autopsy table?" she asked. Jack touched the smooth metal with one hand. "Not much call for pillows or blankets in the lab," she said. "Jill got the canopy beds and the cushions.
I learned how to sleep on stone floors. Turns out that sort of thing is hard to unlearn. Sleeping in a real bed is like trying to sleep in a cloud. I'm afraid I'll sink right through and fall to my death." She sighed, taking her hand off the autopsy table. "Put her here. I want to look at her before we dissolve her." "Is this a creepy perv thing?" asked Christopher, as he and Nancy maneuvered the body through the lab. "I'm not sure I can stay to help if it's a creepy perv thing." "I don't like corpses in that way, unless they've been reanimated," said Jack. "Corpses are incapable of offering informed consent, and are hence no better than vibrators." "I wish that didn't make so much sense," said Christopher. Together, he and Nancy boosted L'Oreal up onto the autopsy table. He let go and stepped away. Nancy remained, taking a moment to straighten the body's limbs and smooth out its hair. There was nothing she could do for the pits that had been L'Oreal's eyes. She couldn't even close them. In the end, she simply folded L'Oreal's hands over her chest and backed away. Jack moved into the position Nancy had vacated. Unlike the other girl, she didn't shy away from the damage to L'Oreal's face. She leaned in close, studying the striations in the flesh, the way it had been torn and opened. Pulling on a pair of rubber gloves, she reached out and carefully rolled L'Oreal's head to the side, probing her skull with quick, careful motions. Nancy and Christopher watched closely, but nothing Jack was doing was disrespectful. If anything, she was showing more respect to L'Oreal now that she was dead than she ever had when the other girl was among the living. Jack grimaced. "Her skull's been cracked," she said. "Someone hit her from behind hard enough to knock her down and disorient her. I can't say for sure whether it knocked her out. Knocking someone out is harder than most people guess. It was a blitz attack. She didn't have a chance to defend herself or scream for help before she was down. But it wouldn't have killed her right away, and there's quite a lot of blood in her sockets." "Jack." Cade's voice was low and horrified. "Please tell me you're not saying what I think you're saying." "Hmm?" Jack looked up. "I'm not psychic, Cade. I don't even believe that psychics exist. There is no possible way I could read your mind and know what you think I'm saying. I'm simply talking about the manner in which L'Oreal's eyes were extracted." "You mean removed?" asked Christopher. "No, I mean extracted," said Jack. "I'd need to open her skull to be sure, and I don't have a proper bone saw, which makes that a difficult task, but it appears that her eyes were fully extracted, all the way along the optic nerve. Whoever assaulted her didn't just pluck them out like grapes. They used some sort of blade to separate the eye from the muscles holding it in place, and once that was done, they—" "Do you know who did it?" asked Cade. "No." "Then please stop telling us how it was done. I can't take it any more." Jack looked at him solemnly and said, "I haven't gotten to the important part yet." "Then please get there before the rest of us throw up on the floor." "Based on the damage to the skull and the amount of bleeding, she was alive when her eyes were taken," said Jack. Silence greeted her proclamation. Even Nancy put a hand over her mouth. "Whoever did this subdued her, removed her eyes, and let the shock kill her. I'm not even sure her death was the goal, just getting her eyes." "Why?" asked Christopher. Jack hesitated before shaking her head and saying, "I don't know. Come on, Let's prepare her for burial." Cade retreated back to the far side of the basement and stayed there as the others got to work. Nancy undressed L'Oreal, folding each piece of clothing with care before setting it aside. She somehow doubted that these clothes were going to make it into the general supply. They would probably need to be destroyed along with L'Oreal's body, just for the sake of safety. While Nancy worked, Jack and Christopher pulled an old claw-footed bathtub out of a corner of the basement and into the center of the room. Jack uncorked several large glass jugs and poured their greenish, fizzing contents into the tub. Cade watched this with dismay. "Why does Eleanor let you have that much acid?" he asked. "Why would you want that much acid? You don't need that much acid." "Except that it appears I do, since I have just enough to dissolve a human body, and we have a human body in need of dissolving," said Jack. "Everything happens for a reason. And Eleanor didn't let me have this much acid. I sort of collected it on my own, for a rainy day." "What were you expecting it to rain?" asked Christopher. "Bears?" "There was always a chance we'd get lucky," said Jack. She pulled several plastic aprons off a shelf and held them out to the others. "You're going to want to put one of these on, and a pair of the gloves that go with them. Acid is not a fun exfoliator unless you come from Christopher's world." Wordlessly, Nancy and Christopher donned their plastic aprons, rubber gloves, and goggles. Jack did the same, and together they lowered L'Oreal into the fizzing green liquid. Cade turned his face away. The smell was surprisingly pleasant, not meaty at all. It smelled like cleaning fluid, faintly citrus with a minty undertone. The bubbles increased as L'Oreal disappeared beneath the surface, until the liquid was completely opaque, obscuring her from view. Jack turned away. "It'll take about an hour to reduce her to a skeletal state," she said. "I'll neutralize the acid and drain it off when she's done. Christopher, do you think you can handle her from there?" "She'll dance for me." Christopher touched the bone in his pocket. Nancy realized there were small indentations in the surface. Not holes, not quite, and yet it still managed to suggest a flute. The tunes he played on that instrument wouldn't be audible to the living. That didn't mean they wouldn't be real. "All skeletons dance for me. It's my honor to play for them." "All right. Clearly the two of you," Jack gestured to Nancy as she stripped off her gloves, "were meant to be together. If you can't find your doors, you should get married and breed the next generation of creepy world-traveling children." Christopher's cheeks turned red. Nancy's didn't. It was a pleasant change. "Maybe we should figure out why people are dying before we start trying to set up a breeding program," said Cade mildly. "Besides, I met Nancy first. I get asking out dibs." "Sometimes I suspect you learned all your hallmarks of masculinity from a Neanderthal," said Jack. She removed her apron, hanging it on a nearby hook. "Everyone please take off the gear you borrowed. That stuff is expensive, and I only get to place 3 orders a year." "Do I get a say in this?" asked Nancy, shooting an amused look over at Cade. She didn't mind flirting. Flirting was safe. Flirting was fun. Flirting was a way of interacting with her peers without anyone realizing that there was anything strange about her. She could have flirted forever. It was just the things that came after flirting that she had no interest in. "Maybe later," said Jack. "Right now we need to get out of here. The acid will do some off-gassing as it breaks down her tissues, and I don't want to fill my lungs with L'Oreal. Besides, I shouldn't leave Jill alone for too long." She sounded uneasy. "I'm sure no one will hurt your sister," said Nancy. "She can take care of herself." "That's what I'm worried about," said Jack. "When you spend years with a vampire, all those lessons about don't bite the other children sort of go out the window. If they corner her because they've decided I'm guilty, she's liable to hurt someone just so she can get away. I'd rather not get expelled right after I've disposed of a body. Seems like a waste of good acid." "All right," said Nancy, pulling her apron off over her head. "Let's go." Since they were no longer trying to spare their fellow students the sight of L'Oreal's body, the foursome walked up the interior stairs, emerging into the deserted hallway. Cade looked in both directions before turning to Jack and asking, "Where would she go?" "How would I know?" asked Jack. She sighed when the others stared at her. "I'm her twin. I'm not her keeper. I'm not even her friend. We mostly stick together out of self-defense. The other girls think she's weird, and they think I'm weirder. At least when we present a united front, they're less likely to do things to us." "Things?" asked Nancy blankly. Jack fixed her with a look that was equal parts pitying and envious. "You didn't get a hazing phase. That's the real reason Eleanor put you in with Sumi. Once Sumi liked you, or at least tolerated you, no one else was going to cross the line because everyone knew better than to mess with Sumi. She was vicious. Nonsense girls always are. Jill and I remember when you got here," said Christopher. "I thought your sister was hot, you know, so I offered to show her around the school. Figured maybe I could get in good before one of the other guys showed up and started talking about his magic sword and how he'd saved the universe or whatever. I'm a dude with a flute no one can hear. I have to be persistent." "She laughed at you, didn't she?" Most people would have been surprised by the gentleness of Jack's tone. She wasn't the sort of person who seemed inclined to gentleness. Christopher nodded. "She said I was a cute little boy, but that she couldn't lower herself to be seen with me. Like, that was her opening statement. Not thanks, no thanks, not my name's Jill, just straight to, you're a cute little boy. I stopped trying after that." "She was trying to save you, in her way," said Jack. "Her master was the jealous sort. She used to try to make friends with the kids from the village below his castle. Jill liked having a lot of friends around. Believe it or not, she used to be the gregarious one. Even if it was a nerdy sort of friendly, she'd run you to ground to tell you about the latest episode of Doctor Who. This was early on, before she'd embraced the lacy dresses and the iron-rich diet. Back then, she thought we were just having an adventure. She was the one who thought we were going to go home someday and wanted to learn as much as she could." "And you?" asked Cade. "I gave up on wanting to go home the second Dr. Bleak put a bone saw in my hand and told me he would teach me anything I wanted to know," said Jack. "For a while, Jill was opening doors and looking for a road home, and I was the one who never wanted to leave." "What happened to the kids from the village?" asked Christopher. "The ones she tried to make friends with." Jack's expression went blank. It wasn't coldness exactly, more a means of distancing herself from what she was about to say. "We lived in the grace and at the sufferance of a vampire lord. What do you think happened to the kids from the village? Her master didn't want her talking to anyone he couldn't control. I think he only spared me because Dr. Bleak begged, and because he pointed out the wisdom in keeping a self-replenishing source of blood transfusions for Jill. We're twins. If anything happened to her, I could be used for spare parts.
Nancy's mouth dropped open. "That's horrible," she squeaked.
That was the Moors. Jack shook her head. It was cruel and cold and brutal and beautiful, and I would give anything to go back there. Maybe it broke me in some deep, intrinsic way that I am incapable of seeing, just like Jill can't understand that she's not a normal girl anymore. I don't care. It was my home, and it finally let me be myself. And I hate it here.
"We pretty much all hate it here," said Cade. "Even me. That's why we're at this school. Now think. Your sister isn't in the basement, so where would she go?"
She might still be in the dining hall, since it's harder to pick on her when there's supervision around, said Jack. Or she could have gone out to sit in the trees and pretend that she's back at home. We spent a lot of time outside there, for one reason or another.
"We saw her there yesterday," said Cade. "Nancy and I will go check the trees. You and Christopher check the dining hall. We'll meet back at the attic no matter what we find."
"Why the attic?" asked Christopher.
But Jack was nodding.
"Good call. We can go through your books while L'Oreal finishes stewing. Maybe there's something in there about why someone would be harvesting parts from world walkers. It's a long shot. At this point, I'll take it. Come on, Bone Boy."
She turned and strode down the hall, every inch the confident mad scientist's protégé once again. Any vulnerability she had shown was gone, tamped down and covered over by the mask she wore.
"Thanks for sticking me with the scary girl,"
said Christopher to Cade, and ran after her, pulling the bone flute from his pocket. "You're welcome," Cade called after him. He offered his arm to Nancy, grinning. "Come on, let's go see if we can't find ourselves an Adams." His drawl grew thicker, dripping from his words like sweet and tempting honey. Nancy set her hand in the crook of his elbow, feeling the traitorous red creeping back into her cheeks. This was always the difficult part, back when she'd been at her old school, explaining that asexual and aromantic were different things. She liked holding hands and trading kisses. She'd had several boyfriends in elementary school, just like most of the other girls, and she had always found those practice relationships completely satisfying. It wasn't until puberty had come along and changed the rules that she'd started pulling away in confusion and disinterest. Cade was possibly the most beautiful boy she'd ever seen. She wanted to spend hours sitting with him and talking about pointless things. She wanted to feel his hand against her skin, to know that his presence was absolute and focused entirely on her. The trouble was, it never seemed to end there, and that was as far as she was willing to go. Cade must have read her discomfort, because he flashed her a smile and said, "I promise I'm a gentleman. You're as safe with me as you are with anyone who's not the murderer." "And see, I was just trying to decide whether I thought you might be the killer," said Nancy. "I'm really relieved to hear that you're not." "I'm not either, just for the record." "That's good to know," said Cade. They walked together through the deserted manor. Whispers sometimes drifted from the rooms they passed, indicating the presence of their fellow students.
They didn't stop. Everyone had their own concerns, and Nancy had an uneasy feeling that by helping Jack destroy L'Oreal's body, she had just placed herself firmly in the enemy camp for anyone who had been a friend of L'Oreal's when she was alive. Nancy had never made so many enemies before, or so quickly. She didn't like it. She just didn't see a way to undo it. There was no one outside. The lawn was empty as she and Cade walked toward the trees. Even the crows had flown away, off to look for some richer pickings. Everything was silent, eerily so. Jill wasn't in the trees. That was almost a disappointment. Nancy had been fully expecting to step into the sheltered grove and see the other girl sitting on a root, posed like something out of a Gothic novel, with her parasol blocking out any stray sunbeams that had dared to come too close. Instead, the sun shone down undisturbed, and Nancy and Cade were alone. "Well, that's one down," said Nancy, suddenly nervous. What if Cade wanted to kiss her? What if Cade didn't want to kiss her? There was no good answer, and so she did what she always did when she was confused or frightened. She froze, becoming a girl-shaped statue. "Whoa," said Cade. He sounded genuinely impressed. "That's some trick. Do you actually turn into stone? Or does it only seem like you do?" He prodded her gently in the arm with one finger. "Nope, still flesh. You're holding really, really still. But you're not inanimate. How are you doing that? Are you even breathing? I can't do that." "The Lady of Shadows required that everyone who served her be able to hold properly still," said Nancy, releasing her pose. Her cheeks reddened again. This was all going so wrong. "I'm sorry, I tend to freeze up when I get nervous." "Don't worry, you're safe with me," said Cade. "Whoever the killer is, they're only striking when people are alone. We'll stick together and we'll be fine." "But you're what I'm nervous about," thought Nancy. She forced a wan smile. "If you really think so," she said. "Jill isn't here. We should get back to the attic before Jack and Christopher start to worry about us." They walked side by side back the way that they had come, Nancy's fingers resting on Cade's arm, and her eyes scanning the grassy expanse of the lawn, looking for some clue as to what had happened. There had to be something that would bring all this together, that would force it to make sense. They couldn't just be at the mercy of an unseen killer who slaughtered them for no apparent reason. "Hands," she murmured. "What's that?" asked Cade. "I was just thinking about Sumi's hands," she said. "She was really good with her hands, you know? Like they were the most important thing about her. Maybe someone is trying to take away the things we treasure the most. I don't know why, though, or how they'd know." "It makes sense," said Cade. They had reached the porch steps. As they started up, he said, "Most of the students lost the things that were most precious to them when their doors closed. Maybe someone's so heartbroken that they're trying to make sure nobody gets to be happy. If they have to be miserable, so does everyone else." "But you're not miserable when you're dead," said Nancy. "I sure do hope not," said Cade, and reached for the doorknob. The door opened before he touched it.